Terrific. The voice you're hearing, I don't know if you can see my face. I'm Miriam Cass. I'm the principal at Akiba Schechter, and we are thrilled to have you with us here, Mr. Ebstein. Thank you very, very much for spending a bit of your morning with us.
Well, and I'm thrilled and honored to have been asked to join you today.
Wonderful. So, Ms. Roden, would you like to kick us off?
Sure. Good to see you again. I've known Mr. Ebstein for many, many, many years. His wife was my music teacher when I was a student way back when. He has a really interesting story. I said he was born in Germany, and I'm going to let him fill you in from there. But these are our middle schoolers who are already starting to ask questions, but definitely want to hear your story and are ready to listen.
Hi to all of you. And, I'm not only honored to be here, but I'm very pleased because my family and I have a lot of connections with Akiba Schechter. My son, Stephen, was a student when it was just Akiba.
Oh, wow.
And my wife, Roz, of course, was the music teacher for several years. So there's a possibility that David might even ask to join us. I'm not sure.
So I see right now that you have a son and daughter-in-law and grandchildren joining from Israel.
Yes.
Oh, that's wonderful.
That's my older son, David, Rabbi David.
We will spotlight that family for a moment so you can all see. This is your daughter-in-law.
Hi, guys.
I can unmute you. You can say hello.
Shalom לכולם. אנחנו מאוד שמחים להיות איתכם היום. Hello, children. We're so excited to be with you today. You might see some of Saba Bernie. That's actually our Saba Bernie. And you may see some of Saba Bernie's grandchildren jumping online. They all have the last name Ebstein as well. I am Saba Bernie's very lucky daughter-in-law. So, and his son is coming any second now.
Wonderful. Well,
thank you for having us.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Okay, back.
I would also like to suggest to all of the students here that if you have a question, interrupt me and ask the question. We'll see how that works. I guess you have to raise your hand if you want to speak.
I've given them the ability to unmute themselves, but I think it would be helpful if they did the electronic hand raising, and then I'll call on them, and they can unmute themselves then.
Okay. So let me tell you a little bit about my life in Hitler's Germany. I was born in 1929 in Stuttgart, a city in the south of Germany with a population of about 500,000 people. I grew up and lived there until October 1939, when I immigrated with my family to the United States. I was 3 years old when Hitler came to power, which was in 1933. And I'll tell you a little bit about being Jewish in Nazi Germany, about my experiences there, and about our family. And then at the end, maybe a little bit about how I felt about that whole experience. As Jews in Germany, we had many experiences that made my sisters. I have two sisters. One is no longer alive. And we had experience that scared us plenty. And I'll tell you about those in a little while. And I can only guess how worried our parents must have been, both for themselves and for us. But they tried very hard to shield us from that. But I also remember that during the 10 years that I lived in Germany, there were lots of happy times. First of all, I was surrounded by loving relatives. A lot of Ebsteins lived in Stuttgart. There were many happy occasions, birthdays and other celebrations. I especially loved it when I got to lead the Birkat on Friday nights. I loved the singing and laughing at family seders, lighting candles and getting presents on Hanukkah. I loved school and I felt safe there until Kristallnacht, but more of that later. Other good memories involved attending Shabbat morning and Yom Tov services regularly at our synagogue. Our synagogue had a mechitza, so sometimes I sat with my mother upstairs and with my sisters in the balcony. But more often I was downstairs with the men next to my grandfather, one or more of my uncles and cousins. My father conducted the choir, so he could never sit with us. The synagogue and the Jewish community of Stuttgart played a very important part in my life. It was called a liberal congregation, which meant that it had a choir with both men and women singing and an organ. But as I told you, there was a mechitza. The women sat in the balcony and the men, all wearing yarmulkes and talesim, were on the main floor. The service was conducted entirely by the cantor, and the congregation's two rabbis alternated giving the sermon. The Jewish community in Stuttgart also had a very active cultural life. There was a theater group, a chorus, and a symphony orchestra that my father played in. Music was also an integral part of our family's life. At home, I often fell asleep listening to the sounds of Beethoven and Schubert trios in the room next to where I slept, because my father, a cousin who was a pianist, and friends would come to our house and play. My alarm clock on Sunday mornings was my father practicing the violin. He was a very talented violinist. But I guess the most important influence that the Jewish community in Stuttgart had on my life was the fact that the community, right after Hitler came to power, decided to establish a Jewish day school. And that was in 1933. My younger sister Martha and I went to the Jewish day school. My older sister Carla had started school before Hitler came to power, so she attended the German public school. But many Jewish parents then sent their children to the Jewish day school because they sensed the increasing anti-Semitism that was happening in Germany. We studied very similar curriculum, I think, to the one you do. Hebrew and the standard secular subjects, and also English, because a lot of families wanted to and hoped come to the United States, and they wanted to prepare for that. We had a strictly kosher home. until 1936, because in 1936, the German parliament passed a series of laws called the Nuremberg laws, which made it a crime to do kosher slaughtering, so we could no longer buy kosher meat. We still kept dairy and meat separate, and of course observed Shabbat and the holidays. My mother always lit candles on Friday night. And I learned the Berkat Hamazon by heart because we recited it every Friday night, never missed. But we children also became aware of anti-Semitism pretty early in our lives. Even before we started school, our parents made it very clear to us that we were Jewish, and therefore we children had always to be especially well behaved in public. Because if we didn't, we were afraid the Germans would say, "Oh, look at those Jewish children." And it might even get us into serious trouble. Also, after I learned to read, I regularly went to a nearby park where there was a display case of a very anti-Semitic newspaper called Der Stürmer. It was full of vicious anti-Semitic propaganda and cartoons. And then also later on, when we walked to school every morning, we would pass restaurants and a movie house that had big signs on their windows or doors that said Juden verboten, which means Jews not allowed. We weren't allowed to go to those restaurants or to the movie house. Now, my younger sister Martha and I went to the Jewish day school, but our older sister, she was 6 years older than I, went to public elementary school. Somebody talking to me?
Nope, I'll check and make sure the microphones are off.
So when my sister Carla graduated grammar school from the German public school that she went to, she that time, for the first time, directly affected our lives, because Jewish children were not allowed to go to German high schools. So my parents sent my sister Carla to England to a boarding school. And my older sister, whom I loved very much, was no longer at home with us. And then a year later, my father, who was a traveling salesman, completely lost all his work because he was Jewish. And we were supported by other members of the family and by the Jewish community. So those were some of the ways in which we experienced anti-Semitism, both indirectly and then very directly. Now, the most memorable event in my life in Germany was Kristallnacht, or the night of the broken glass. This happened during the night from November 9th to 10th in 1938. On that night, all throughout Germany and Austria, Hitler's stormtroopers and hoodlums smashed display windows in Jewish stores, completely destroyed about 7,000 Jewish stores and businesses, many homes, vandalized cemeteries, and most significantly of all, burned 267 synagogues. And that was almost every single synagogue in Germany and Austria. 100 Jews were killed that night, and then in the next few days, about 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and thrown into concentration camps. That included one of my uncles. The name Kristallnacht was, or the Night of Broken Glass, came from the fact that all the display windows in practically every Jewish store in the country was broken. And the sidewalks were littered with broken glass. That morning, the next morning on November 10th, Martha and I, not knowing anything about what had happened, walked to school as we always did. It took us about half an hour, maybe 40 minutes to get there. On the way, we passed quite a number of stores with all their windows broken and all the glass on the sidewalks in front of them. But we had no idea what had happened. Now, our school, the Jewish Day School, was right next door to the synagogue, which was a big, impressive building. Now I'm going to try and show you a picture of it. Tell me if you can see it. Can you see the synagogue here? And,
up a little bit.
like this?
Yeah, that's good.
Take a look at that round window. I'll talk about that in a minute. That's the outside. This is the inside. You can see that it was a magnificent building, a wonderful synagogue. When we turned the corner of the street that had the synagogue and the school on it, we could see that there was no more glass in that big round window that I talked about. And there was black soot all around the outside of where the window had been. So we knew that there was a fire. There was a policeman, one lone policeman standing on the sidewalk, and he saw us and he said, "Go home, children. You won't have any school today." Now, because, you know, it was quite a ways from our house from our apartment building where we lived to the school, we always had enough money with us to take a streetcar, and that was in case it rained. Well, we took the streetcar home that day, even though it didn't rain. Now, before I tell you what happened the next day, I want to make an observation. It's this. Sometimes you'll see from what I tell you that the direction our life takes is due to just pure luck. And you'll see what I mean in a minute. The next morning, after we had gone to school and come home right away, An adult cousin of mine called our house very early in the morning and told my parents that her father had just been arrested by the Gestapo, the German secret police. She strongly suggested that my father should get out of the house because the Gestapo might come to our house and arrest him. So he took her advice and went to the American consulate in Stuttgart. I later found out, many years later, that the grounds of the American consulate were filled with over 1,000 Jewish men, because it was the American consulate and the property around the building was technically American, so no one could arrest those men who were near the consulate. A little later that morning.
Let me just interrupt for 1 second.
Sure.
Sorry, I see a question from Matthew.
Yes, Matthew.
Okay, so I have a couple things. One of them's a comment. Your father seems very talented. That was one thing. Two, it kind of seems like the way you're telling it that the Germans only destroyed the windows of the synagogues. Did they only destroy the windows, or did they like burn everything down?
They completely burned it.
Okay.
And from the picture, you could see that it was a stone, large stones made up the outside of the synagogue. So only the inside burned.
Okay. And did you kind of like see all this anti-Semitic stuff getting bigger and bigger, or did it just hit you like at its biggest form?
Well, I know that it happened gradually, but pretty quickly. But that's something I know about because, remember, I was 3 years old when Hitler became the dictator of Germany. And it was a couple of years before I really knew what was going on in the outside world.
And last question. In the beginning, you mentioned like that you immigrated, am I correct?
Yes.
Was it like immigration where like you can only take the stuff that you can carry, or is it like you take everything you want?
No, we were lucky enough, we did this early enough so that our immigration was legal. And we were able to send a lot of our furniture, all the belongings that we wanted to bring to the United States. We could do that. And our clothes, suitcases. The only restriction was that the amount of money that we could take out of Germany was exactly the equivalent of $10. We could, rich people couldn't take all of their money, and whatever we had, we could only take $10 of that.
Okay, thank you.
I see there are a few more questions, but I'd like to ask you to, would you like to continue, or would you like to hear the questions first?
Well, if we have time, let me take a couple more questions.
Okay, Matea. Matea. Let's see. I've unmuted you. Can you speak a little louder, closer to the mic, maybe?
So you said that the windows were like that, from the broken window you could see the ash.
Yes.
So they burned, like they didn't burn the outside, they only burned the inside, or did they burn a little bit of the outside too?
Well, the outside was stone, so it just didn't burn. But since the flames were so hot, it was the flames that must have broken the glass in that window, and then there was black soot all around that window.
Okay, and when the policeman told you not to come into school because you weren't going to have it, did you know why, or were you confused?
Well, I don't remember exactly what I thought at that moment, but I knew that something terrible had happened, and if a policeman told us to go home, we better go home quickly.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, good questions.
Gabe Bosches?
I wanted to know that when you went to America, did you have to go through another country, or did you just go straight to America?
No, the reason we wanted to come to America is my father had a cousin who had come to this country, sometime in the 1920s, in other words, before Hitler. And he provided the affidavit, which means a guarantee that when we got to this country, if my father didn't find a job right away, there was somebody who would make sure that we could live someplace and that we didn't have to ask the government for money.
Please
So that's why we
continue.
came here.
Thank you. Why don't you go ahead and continue, and we'll get a few more questions in a minute.
Okay. So I was talking about my cousin Carrie, who was a little bit older than I was, a few years. She didn't live very far away, and she came that morning. This was the November 11th, because her parents and her older brother also left their house. They didn't want to stay in their house. So she and I were standing at a window in our apartment. We lived on the second floor, and we were looking down at the street and saw 5 men who had suits and hats on, which was very unusual. So we looked at each other and we saw them walking toward our building and said, you know, they look strange. Sure enough, they rang our doorbell, and it turned out to be the Gestapo. 2 of them stayed down below at the front door and the back door of the building, I guess to make sure nobody would run away. And 3 of them came into our apartment, searched it very thoroughly, and found nothing, but finally asked my mother where my father was, where her husband was. And she told them he had gone to the American consulate to check on the status of our application for a visa to come to America. With that, the leader of these 3 guys just motioned to the other 2, and they left. And they never came back. So my point about luck is, if the Gestapo had not arrested my uncle earlier, and if my cousin, his daughter, had not called us when she did, my father would have been at home, and he would probably have been arrested, taken to a concentration camp, and probably I wouldn't be talking to you today. sometimes you just have to be very lucky.
Lila has a question about that.
Yes, Lila.
Did you see your uncle again after he was taken away?
Yes, that's a very good question, because what the Nazis did was they eventually released almost all of those 70,000 Jewish men that they had arrested. You can imagine that while they were in the concentration camps, they were not treated well, and they were scared and had the life scared out of them. And when they released them, they usually released them with the demand that they leave Germany in a very short time. And my uncle was lucky. He had some friends in England. So the day after he got released, he was in the camp Dachau, which is near Munich in southern Germany. Within a day after he was released from there, he went to England. Eventually he came from England to this country and lived in Chicago for the rest of his life. Let me go on and tell you what else happened. Because 3 weeks later, the school was opened again. We went back to school, Martha and I. But every day, we walked past the synagogue to get to the school. And we walked past watching men tearing down the synagogue brick by brick. And then we found out how diabolic and evil the Nazis were, because the men that they hired to do the work were all Jewish. The next March, that's in March of 1939, my father got the visa to come to this country. That is the permission from this country to come here. And then 7 months after that, in October, with the help of 4 American families, Jewish families, he was able to send for my mother, my sister Martha, and me to come here. So that's when we came, and my older sister was still in England, so all of us successfully got out of Germany. A year after we came, my Carla finished high school in England, and then she joined us here also. So we were reunited again. We were very lucky to be able to leave Germany legally the way we did. And there were many others in this large Ebstein family that we had who were also able to escape from Germany. Some ended up in Colombia, and some in Chile in South America, some in Australia, and even one cousin in Shanghai, China. Sadly, 4 of my aunts, 3 of my uncles, and 4 cousins were murdered by the Nazis. The cousin who spotted the 5 Gestapo men on the street with me that day, she, her brother, and her parents were all killed in Auschwitz. And I'd like to conclude with this. my experience as a boy growing up in Nazi Germany made me a much stronger Jew, and has made me adopt a very stubborn commitment to Judaism and to the survival of the Jewish people. It made me appreciate how important it is to have a very firm foundation for one's ethical and moral beliefs. And it made me sensitive to all kinds of social causes and convinced me that Judaism requires us to seek fair and just treatments for human beings in every situation. So I'm ready for more questions if some of the rest of you have questions.
Wow. Thank you very, very much. This was a truly inspiring set of remarks, and really appreciate you sharing your story with us. We do have many questions.
It is my pleasure, I have to tell you. Whenever I get the chance in private conversation or to groups, I tell my story.
Thank you. Thank you. I know that was not always the case for other survivors, and
right. That's
and
right.
It's a privilege for us to hear your story and be able to carry it forward. I do want to allow your 4 grandchildren to say hello. So I have it set so that they can unmute themselves. Let's see, we have Maytal.
Hi.
And Matan. And Noah.
Hello.
And Aaron.
Hello.
Okay.
Hi, you guys.
Hi, Saba.
Good to see you.
Nice to see you.
And we have questions from, let's see, I see a question here from Avia. Avia, will you unmute yourself, please?
Yeah, so after you moved to the US, did you see any of your family members that didn't make it to the US, like in the future?
Well, no, once we came to this country, of course, I saw many other family members who did make it to this country, but no, we, except for one postcard that we got from an aunt of mine who was my mother's sister, we never heard directly from any of those who didn't make it. That aunt wrote a postcard to somebody back where she had lived in Germany, and said they were sweeping streets and being very, very careful what she said. She said, the fashion here is slim, which was her way of saying we don't get enough to eat.
Wow.
Yeah, wow. Gabe Bashes has a question for you.
What year did you come to America?
1939. We arrived in October 1939. And if you are a history buff, then you'll know that in September 1939, the Second World War started. That's when the Nazis marched into Poland, and Poland surrendered 2 weeks later. So when we left Germany in October, the Second World War had already started, and we went on a Dutch passenger ship called the SS Rotterdam, and it went through the English Channel between French and British destroyers because the British and French warships were blockading the English Channel so that the German Navy could not get into the Atlantic Ocean.
Thank you. Matea. Remember to come close to the mic, Matea.
How did you find out that they were Jewish?
How did I find out that I was Jewish?
No, the people who were tearing down the synagogue. How did you find out that they were Jewish?
You know, I don't remember exactly who told us. But, you know, there were lots of Jewish people in Stuttgart, and so I'm sure they knew. Some of them must have been their sons, and they told other people. And somebody told my parents, and our parents told us.
Thank you. Romy. Romy?
Sorry. When you came to America, did you know the language, or did you just come to a strange land not knowing how to talk?
That's a wonderful question. In the day school we went to, I had had about a half a year of English as one of the subjects. So I knew a little English when we came here. And I was in the 4th grade. We first came to a very small little town in southern Illinois. Its name is Heron. And I'm sure some of you have heard of Carbondale, where Southern Illinois University is. Well, Heron's about 40 miles from there. And I was in 4th grade. My sister Martha was in 3rd grade. And they immediately had us work 4th grade and 3rd grade arithmetic, but gave us 1st grade readers. And I think in about 4 to 6 weeks, we were up to 4th grade and 3rd grade readers.
That's good. That's fast.
Wow. Impressive. Ronit.
Nobody spoke German.
You didn't have a choice, right?
That's right. Ronit?
Did you ever go back to Germany after you came to America?
Is something with your mic, so
here's the question
again.
She asked, did you ever go back to Germany after you came to America?
Yes, I did, once. Stuttgart had a program, and many other German cities had the same program, which they invited Jewish people who had left Germany to come back for 2 weeks for a kind of a conclave, a kind of a meeting, and with the people from the cities. And I went back, met with a lot of other people who came for that same 2-week period, including one of my classmates that I had been in 1st grade with. And we had meetings. We were taken to see parts of the city and concerts, and in a way to welcome us back and to make us feel that they were trying to make some amends for what had happened to us. But that was the only time that I went back.
Jacob.
So were the what's it called? Was the window of the synagogue stained glass?
Yes, it was.
Did it have like a pattern or a picture on it, or is it just colors?
No, just colors and sort of kind of like a floral pattern.
Oh, that's nice.
Yes.
Very pretty. Sounds very pretty.
It was. It was an impressive window.
That's my only question.
Josh Zaff.
When you said earlier that you can bring $10 out, does that mean $10 for each of you or $10 as a family?
That is a very good question. I think it was $10 for each adult. So
very much.
In my case, no, it certainly wasn't. It was in itself an insult.
You have a question from your son, David.
Yes, David.
Hi, Dad.
Hi.
I'm wondering if you had an opportunity the night before you left Germany to do something special in front of all of the refugees who were going to get on the SS Rotterdam with you.
You know the answer to that, but I will tell everyone.
Hey, Ron wants you to tell the story.
Well, I will if I can, because it's a powerful memory. We left Germany and went to the harbor in Rotterdam on a Friday night and stayed at a boarding house where there were many other German Jewish refugees also getting ready to board the same ship and come to this country. So that evening, we were all in a big dining room and had supper together. And at the end of the meal, somebody said, well, it's Shabbos. We ought to say the Birkat Hamazon. Nobody volunteered. So my mother volunteered me, and because I had learned it by memory, I led the maybe 30, 40 or so people who were in that dining room in the Birkat Hamazon.
Wow.
And as I say, it is still a very powerful memory for me.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that one. Sammy.
Did you know that there was like all the stuff was broken, or did you not know?
Well, it wasn't very many days that we found out that all the broken glass that we saw when we passed stores, that those were all Jewish-owned stores, and that this was something that happened all over Germany, in every town, in every city where there was a Jewish store. So we knew. We were,
also,
we found out.
Also, how did you get to America? Like, what did you take to America?
How did we come? We came on a big ocean liner called the SS Rotterdam. It was the second largest passenger ship at that time in the company that's called the Holland America Line. It still is a shipping line, and mostly they do cruises now.
Annabelle, you have a question?
Okay. So how long was your dad at the consulate? Because you said you asked your mom where is he? Was he there for a day or something, and then he came back, or was he like there?
He came back that
He just
evening.
didn't come back.
He stayed there pretty much all day. And as I say, I found out that he was one of maybe 1,000 people who hung out at the consulate so that they would be safe.
Okay.
Ron Lev.
Thanks. So were rubles the German currency?
The German currency is called marks.
And also my grandfather was also in the Holocaust, and he actually had his bar mitzvah on the Exodus.
Oh, he did?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And pretty much all of his family died from the concentration camps like Auschwitz, and
yeah.
I think his father, but also part of his family died from I bet some of you don't know that there was gas coming out of the showers. So part of his family died from that. And what?
Was your grandfather in a camp?
Auschwitz.
He was in Auschwitz and he survived.
Yeah.
Yes, he must have been a strong young man.
Yeah. But my mother's side, by the way, my grandfather's on my dad's side, and my mother's side actually luckily got out before World War II happened. So yeah.
Yes, they were lucky the way we were lucky.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ron Lev. Ezra Erlbacher.
I guess with so much anti-Semitism in the United States now, what are your thoughts on it, and what would your message be to us, like growing up with all of it?
What are my thoughts on what? Say that again, please.
Anti-Semitism in the United States.
Well, I'm very much aware of it, and it seems to be something that we Jews always have to look out for and fight in the best way we know how.
Thank you.
Ezra Bader. Ezra Bader, are you able to?
Yeah, sorry.
Oh, that's okay.
While I was on my cruise in December and January, we actually saw, we were in the Bahamas and we actually saw the SS Rotterdam while in port.
Uh-huh. Yes. I'll tell you something I found out about that. The SS Rotterdam that I was on with my mother and sister was in the Rotterdam harbor in May of 1940 when the Germans bombed the harbor, and they sank that ship. And after the war, the Holland America Line built a new ship and again called it the SS Rotterdam.
Wow.
Oh, okay.
Wow. Interesting.
Yes.
Aiden Jones.
How did it take you to get to America?
How long was the boat ride?
I'm glad you asked that question, because that ship ordinarily took about 6 days to come from Rotterdam to New York. But it had, it operated with 2 engines, and one of those engines was broken. So it could go only half as fast as it ordinarily did. And so it took us 13 days to cross the Atlantic, which in the middle of the Atlantic, there was a big storm, and I got very seasick for 2 days. Stayed in bed practically the whole time for 2 days during that storm.
Was it a boring trip?
No, as a matter of fact, Martha and I really kind of enjoyed most of the trip. And the reason was that on the ship, you ate breakfast. Between breakfast and lunch, you could get some soup at various places on the ship with crackers. And then there was lunch. And in the afternoon, there was again some kind of snack. And then after supper, we got dessert and usually had ice cream. And ice cream was a real treat. I remember on my either 8th or 9th birthday, my birthday present was an ice cream cone. It was that special.
Wow. First, I want to thank our middle schoolers for being so wonderfully attentive and thoughtful with your questions, and your you are missing some of your morning classes, and that is, there's a good reason. You are getting a real treat to listen to Mr. Ebstein and to learn his stories. It's a privilege for us. So thank you for your patience as we are doing something a little bit different, even in this different time, these days of everything being different. This is yet another difference, and thank you for being patient.
And I have to thank you for being such an appreciative audience.
We are.
Asking very good questions.
So the next question is from a familiar grandchild, I think. Iran?
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, Saba, what your feeling towards Germany is today, and if you would drive a German car.
Well, I decided after the war that I would try not to buy any German goods, because so much of German industry was directly involved in the Second World War. But I also decided that as far as the German people are concerned, I'm going to try to judge any German person that I meet on their own terms and judge them for who they are and what they are. And of course, by now, there would not be anybody who's been involved directly in what the Nazis did.
Thank you. Adira, did you have a question?
Do you know why they only wanted to take your father?
Yes, and that's another really good question. First of all, a little background. The American immigration law at that time was that you had to have somebody in this country, in the United States, who would guarantee that you'd never go on welfare. So they had to let the government know how much money they had in the bank, and they had to have enough to satisfy. It was very strange to me. The particular consul, who was the American officer in Germany, who decided whether or not this guarantee, it was called an affidavit, was big enough for one person, 2, 3. And the consul, who was in Stuttgart, not a very nice guy, to say the least, decided that the affidavit that my father's cousin provided was only big enough for one person and not for the whole family. And here's another wonderful piece of luck that we had, because the Jewish committee called the Joint Distribution Committee, we called it the Joint, told my father in New York, where we had some relatives, he said, look, you've been here for 4 weeks and you haven't been able to find a job. I think you have a better chance if you go to the interior of the United States. So they gave him a train ticket to go to St. Louis. And in St. Louis, he went to the Joint, and a Jewish family that owned a bunch of stores in southern Illinois, in Heron and in other towns in Illinois, had listed a job opening. And my father got that job. In Heron, there were 4 Jewish families, extended families. And those families are the ones who provided the affidavit for my mother, my sister Martha, and me.
Wow. It's more luck, right?
Exactly. I usually half a dozen times a day remind myself how lucky I have been in my life.
Yeah. It's a good reminder for us too, especially now.
Yes.
Matthew, I assume that's who Freckles is? Matthew. Did you unmute yourself, Matthew?
Can't hear you, Matthew.
If you could change one part of your whole entire story, what would you change?
You mean if there was something I could do?
Yeah, you could do something differently.
If I could do something differently. I really have to think about that, because it's hard to know. I don't know that I would be able to do anything much differently as we were leaving Germany. I do wish that I had asked my parents more about their experiences that they had, that maybe they didn't tell their children.
That's that's a subtle message also to all of you. You have opportunities, especially in these long days where you can't go out very much. Ask questions. Learn about your parents' and grandparents' histories. There's so much to be gained by doing that, as we're doing here together. Ronlev, I noticed that your hand is up again. Did you want to add something to your earlier questions?
Yeah. So, what happened to your father what happened to your father? Did you meet up with him again when you were at America?
Yes. It when we came to America, we stayed with our relatives in New York for a few days, and then we got on a train and took the train to first St. Louis and then Heron. And as it turned out, we arrived in Heron on my father's birthday. We were a birthday present for him.
That's wonderful.
Okay, so also, what happened to all the Nazis and the Nazi leader?
Oh, that that would take a long time to explain, but
Did they get
Hitler and his propaganda minister Goebbels and his family all killed themselves.
Okay, but are there still Nazis left?
Well, I think there are some very old people still alive in Germany who probably were Nazis during the Second World War and around that time. And you know, we have a bunch of people in this country who call themselves Nazis now. They're not very pleasant people. And we have to watch what they talk about and what they say, because they can cause a lot of mischief.
This is true. Thank you very, very much. I'm looking through just to be sure I'm not missing any other hands that are up. Again, thank you so much to our students for being such wonderful listeners.
Oh, yes, and asking such good questions.
I want to be sure, Dr. Jones, did you want to ask or comment on anything?
Sure. First of all, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
And to you guys, you guys always impress me at every meeting we have, but you took it to a new level today with your insightful questions. And I wanted to, because everyone's experience is always different, and it sounds like there's been so many things along your journey that were almost miraculous. And you talked about how you grew up, and I'm just wondering where, it's faith is a difficult thing when going through something so challenging. And I'm wondering what that journey's been like for you. And, when you talk about luck, where faith plays a role there.
I'll be very honest with you. My faith has been seriously questioned. I question faith. And that's why I call it luck. Because I'm not sure that there was anything that I ever did that made me deserve the good life I've been able to live. And that's why I call it luck.
Well, you definitely are very lucky with your, looks like a very large, wonderful family.
You bet.
Yeah. We're going to give granddaughter Noah, or is it a grandson? I think Noah, I'm guessing, is a woman.
Noah's a girl.
Yes.
Right.
So I actually wanted to turn to you guys, to all these amazing students who are so attentive and ask such incredible questions. And I wanted to brag about my grandfather for 1 second and tell you that every time we would come to the United States to see our grandparents and he would pick us up from the airport, he would never ask us things about our lives or how his school was. I mean, he did ask us a lot of questions, but he would ask us, what good questions did you ask at school today? And I think that all of you today just embodied my grandfather's philosophy, which is asking questions and being curious and not letting any piece of information or anything about life to pass by you guys, and be curious and study hard. And if you see any injustices, then you act upon them and ask your parents. And I'm just so impressed that these are the students of the future. And I'm really, really just so happy that I could be here.
Thank you so much. What powerful words from you, Noah, and a wonderful, wonderful way to bring this to an end. And we have recorded it, so we'll be happy to share it with you. We look forward to hopefully inviting you to come visit us, Mr. Ebstein, in our building when we all get to return to it. We would love to host you there in person.
All right.
Thank you for helping us mark today, this Yom HaShoah. Thank you, Ms. Roden, for helping to bring Mr. Ebstein to us. We really appreciate that connection you made for us. It's very, very special. Do you have any words, Mr. Ebstein, before we dismiss our students?
Only that it is a privilege and it's a rare opportunity that I can tell my story once to so many people at the same time.
It is. It's wonderful, right?
I really appreciate that, because I think those of us who can have to keep reminding the next and the next and the next generation what happened.